White boys weren't supposed to be backstage at the Apollo Theater in 1964. Not in Harlem. Not during those years when America was tearing itself apart over race. When cities burned and speeches echoed through streets demanding justice. Mick Jagger knew this. He'd been warned by his manager, cautioned by fellow musicians, told explicitly that some boundaries shouldn't be crossed. He came anyway. Because sometimes understanding requires risk, and that night, Jagger was willing to risk everything. The knock on James Brown's dressing room door was tentative, almost apologetic. When the door opened, two worlds collided. British invasion rock and American soul, white privilege and black excellence, youth and hard-earned mastery. James Brown could have turned him away. Many would have. But instead, he gestured Jagger inside, and in that single motion, extended an invitation that transcended music, transcended race, transcended everything the 1960s had tried to keep separate. What followed wasn't just a conversation between two musicians. It was a masterclass in authenticity that Mick Jagger would spend the rest of his life trying to honor. If you want to discover the untold stories behind music's greatest legends, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the moments that changed music history forever. The decision to visit the Apollo hadn't been spontaneous. Mick Jagger had been obsessing over James Brown's records for months, wearing out the grooves on his copy of Live at the Apollo until the vinyl crackled with overuse. The Rolling Stones were gaining momentum in Britain, their blues-influenced rock capturing the rebellion of youth culture. But Jagger knew something was missing. He could hear it in the recordings, could feel it in the way James Brown commanded a crowd, but he couldn't identify it. The technical skill was there, the vocal ability, the stage presence. Yet something fundamental eluded him. It was like trying to recreate a painting while missing the primary colors. The Apollo Theater sat on 125th Street, like a monument to black excellence. Its marquee announcing James Brown and the Famous Flames, in bold letters that seemed to glow even in daylight. Jagger arrived 3 hours before showtime, watching the neighborhood come alive as evening approached. Families walked past, men in sharp suits, women in dresses that caught the spring breeze, children playing stickball in the streets. He was acutely aware of his presence, the way conversations paused when people noticed him, the sidelong glances that carried questions he couldn't answer. A white kid in a leather jacket, clutching a press pass like a shield, waiting outside a theater where he clearly didn't belong. The security guard at the stage door was a man named Marcus, a former boxer whose hands bore the scars of 1,000 fights. He looked at Jagger's press pass with undisguised skepticism, turning it over as if checking for forgery. For a moment, Jagger thought he'd be turned away, sent back to Manhattan with his questions unanswered. But something in his expression, perhaps the genuine admiration that couldn't be faked, made Marcus pause. He nodded toward the door, a gesture so slight it might have been missed. And Jagger slipped inside before the decision could be reversed. The backstage area of the Apollo Theater was a world unto itself. A labyrinth of narrow corridors and cramped dressing rooms where legends were born and careers were shattered. The walls were covered with photographs. Decades of performers who had graced that stage, their faces frozen in moments of triumph or desperation. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, perfume, and the electrical charge that comes before a major performance. Musicians tuned instruments, vocalists ran scales, dancers stretched in corners, everyone preparing for the crucible that was an Apollo audience. Jagger found a spot in the wings where he could watch without being in the way. And when James Brown took the stage, the theater transformed. The energy was unlike anything Jagger had experienced in Britain, where audiences maintained a studied coolness even while enjoying performances. Here, the crowd was part of the show, responding to every move, every note, every gesture with an enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. James Brown fed off that energy, and the audience fed off his response, creating a feedback loop of intensity that built throughout the evening. The famous cape routine came near the end of the set, and Jagger watched in fascination as James Brown collapsed to his knees, seemingly spent from the emotional and physical demands of the performance. An assistant rushed out with a cape, draping it over Brown's shoulders as if covering a boxer who'd gone down in the ring. The audience screamed for more, and Brown attempted to rise, only to collapse again, the cape slipping from his shoulders as he reached toward the microphone. This happened 3 times, each collapse more dramatic than the last, each recovery seemingly impossible. Until finally Brown shed the cape completely and launched into another song with an energy that suggested he'd been resting rather than exhausting himself. The corridor outside James Brown's dressing room was guarded by another member of the security team, a man named Raymond who had worked at the Apollo for 15 years and had seen every kind of fan, hanger-on, and industry parasite try to gain access to the stars. Jagger approached with the press pass extended, explaining in a rush that he was from England, that his band covered American blues and soul, that he just wanted 5 minutes to ask a few questions. Raymond listened with the patience of someone who had heard every variation of this speech, his expression revealing nothing. Then the dressing room door opened, and James Brown stood in the doorway, still wearing the sweat-soaked shirt from his performance, a towel draped around his neck. He looked at Jagger with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, simply assessing. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Brown stepped aside, gesturing for Jagger to enter, and Raymond faded back to his position without comment. Brown didn't speak immediately. He was studying Jagger with the same intensity he'd brought to his performance, evaluating not just what Jagger wanted, but why he wanted it. Whether the young Englishman was capable of understanding what he might be told. Jagger had rehearsed questions during the train ride to Harlem, carefully constructed inquiries about vocal technique and stage presence. But under Brown's gaze, those questions evaporated. Instead, he found himself saying simply, "How do you do it?" Brown's response was to stand up, despite the evident exhaustion still gripping his body, and he began to move. Not dancing exactly, but demonstrating something fundamental about the relationship between body and rhythm. He wasn't trying to teach Jagger a move or a step. He was showing him something about where rhythm lived, about how it connected to breath, to heartbeat, to something primal that existed before music was codified into structures and theory. Brown demonstrated what he called the one, the emphasis on the first beat of the measure that would become the foundation of funk music. But it wasn't just about where to place emphasis. It was about understanding rhythm as a physical phenomenon, something that lived in the body before it reached the ears. He showed Jagger how to find that place in his own body where rhythm originated, how to let movement come from that source rather than imposing it from outside. It was a shift from performing rhythm to embodying it, from executing moves to becoming the music itself. The difference seemed subtle in description, but was revolutionary in practice. Jagger had been trained in the British blues tradition, where authenticity came from faithfulness to the original recordings, from capturing the sound and style of American blues musicians. But what Brown was teaching went deeper than imitation. He was showing Jagger how to find his own authentic relationship to rhythm, how to stop copying and start creating from a genuine source. Brown talked about the years he'd spent developing his style, the countless hours of practice in empty theaters, the performances in small clubs where he'd refined his craft away from scrutiny. He spoke about growing up in Barnwell, South Carolina, where poverty had been absolute and escape had seemed impossible. Music hadn't been a career choice, but a survival strategy, the only way out of circumstances that crushed most people who were born into them. That desperation, that need, had driven him to push performance beyond what seemed physically possible, to find reserves of energy that didn't exist until they were demanded. But then Brown did something unexpected. He asked Jagger to perform, right there in the dressing room. Jagger hesitated, suddenly self-conscious in a way he'd never felt on stage. But Brown insisted, and finally Jagger stood and attempted to recreate some of the moves he'd seen during the show. Brown watched without comment, letting Jagger work through the awkwardness, letting him expose all the ways he was thinking about movement rather than feeling it. When Jagger finished, exhausted and embarrassed, Brown nodded slowly. Then he delivered the critique that would haunt Jagger for decades. "You're performing soul," Brown said quietly. "You're not living it. You're showing me what you think soul looks like, but you haven't found your own source. Until you do, you're just a tourist. You might be a talented tourist, but you're still just visiting someone else's house." The words hit Jagger like a physical blow. He'd come to the Apollo believing he understood soul music, that he could channel its essence through study and practice. Brown was telling him that understanding wasn't enough, that technique wasn't enough, that even genuine admiration wasn't enough. He needed to find his own authentic relationship to the music, his own reason for moving, his own source of the energy that powered performance beyond mere technical execution. Brown wasn't finished. He talked about the difference between white and black experiences in America, not as a judgment but as a simple fact that shaped musical expression. The blues, soul, funk, these genres had emerged from specific historical circumstances, from the need to transform pain into beauty, to create joy in the face of oppression, to assert humanity when society denied it. Jagger could study these forms, could admire them, could even perform them with technical proficiency, but he would always be translating them through his own experience. The question was whether he could find authenticity in that translation, or would remain forever in the realm of imitation. This was the moment that changed everything for Mick Jagger. Not the technical demonstrations, not the performance tips, but this fundamental challenge to his artistic identity. Brown was asking whether Jagger was willing to dig deep enough to find his own authentic source, or whether he would be content to remain a skilled mimic of American forms. The question wasn't about talent or dedication. It was about courage, about the willingness to be vulnerable enough to discover what was genuinely his rather than borrowed. Jagger left the Apollo that night carrying a burden he hadn't anticipated. He'd come seeking confirmation and had received confrontation. He'd wanted tips and techniques and had been given a mirror that reflected all his limitations. But he'd also been given a roadmap, a challenge that would drive his artistic development for the rest of his career. James Brown had shown him that authenticity wasn't about perfecting imitation, but about finding your own truth and having the courage to express it. Over the following weeks, Jagger began to experiment with different approaches to performance. He stopped trying to replicate James Brown's moves directly and started exploring what movement meant to him, what his body wanted to do when the music played. It was awkward at first, self-conscious and forced. But gradually something shifted. He found a looser, more androgynous style that drew from multiple sources: rock and roll swagger, blues, authenticity, and yes, elements of soul and funk, but filtered through his own experience as a British art school dropout, navigating fame and creativity. The change didn't happen overnight. In concerts throughout late 1964 and into 1965, you can see Jagger working through these questions in real time, some performances more confident than others, some moments of breakthrough followed by retreats into familiar patterns. But slowly, steadily, he developed a stage presence that was distinctly his own, informed by James Brown, but not imitative, respectful of American traditions, but not bound by them. The famous moves that would become Jagger's signature, the rooster strut, the hip swivels, the particular way he used the microphone stand as a prop, all emerged from this period of experimentation following the Apollo encounter. He was no longer trying to be James Brown or Muddy Waters or any other specific influence. He was becoming Mick Jagger, and that identity was built on the foundation of authenticity that Brown had challenged him to discover. The impact of that backstage encounter extended far beyond Mick Jagger's personal development. As the Rolling Stones' performance style evolved, it influenced an entire generation of British rock musicians who were grappling with similar questions about authenticity and cultural borrowing. The British invasion had been built on American forms, blues and rock and roll translated through British sensibilities. But the question of what made those translations legitimate rather than merely imitative remained unresolved. Jagger never publicly detailed exactly what James Brown told him that night, but the influence was evident in how he spoke about performance in later years. He talked about finding your own truth, about the difference between copying and creating, about the importance of understanding your influences while not being trapped by them. These weren't original insights, but coming from someone who had achieved massive success, they carried weight for younger musicians struggling with similar questions. The relationship between Jagger and Brown remained respectful but distant. They crossed paths at various industry events over the years, always cordial but never developing a genuine friendship. There was an understanding between them, an acknowledgement of that moment at the Apollo when one artist had challenged another to be better, to dig deeper, to find authenticity instead of settling for competence. Brown never claimed credit for Jagger's development, and Jagger was careful to honor Brown's contributions to music without suggesting he had somehow captured or replicated Brown's essence. By 1968, when James Brown released "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud," the landscape of American music had shifted dramatically. The civil rights movement had forced conversations about race into the mainstream, and music was both reflecting and shaping those conversations. Brown's evolution from the hardest working man in show business to a voice of black pride represented a conscious choice to use his platform for social change, to make music that didn't just entertain, but challenged and inspired. The awkward young man who had knocked nervously on a dressing room door in 1964 had become a defining figure of rock and roll. The techniques that James Brown pioneered, the emphasis on rhythm over melody, the use of voice as a percussive instrument, the integration of dance and music into a unified performance. These elements became foundational to funk music and later to hip-hop. When producers began sampling Brown's records in the 1980s and 1990s, they were drawing from the same well of innovation that had impressed Jagger decades earlier. Funky Drummer became one of the most sampled recordings in hip-hop history, its breakbeat providing the foundation for countless tracks that shaped urban music. The story of that Apollo encounter has grown in the telling over the decades, acquiring mythic qualities that may or may not reflect what actually happened. But at its core, the story represents something true about artistic development, about the necessity of finding your own voice even when deeply influenced by others. James Brown challenged Mick Jagger to stop being a tourist and find his own home, his own authentic relationship to music and performance. That challenge, issued in a small dressing room after an exhausting show, reverberated through decades of popular music. What James Brown understood, what he tried to convey to Mick Jagger that night, was that great performance comes from a place beyond technique. You can learn the moves, master the vocal runs, study the timing and dynamics, but without connecting to something genuine within yourself, without finding the source of your own creativity and passion, performance remains hollow. Brown had developed his style from necessity, from the desperate need to escape poverty and create a life through music. That desperation fueled a work ethic and commitment that few could match. Jagger's journey was different. He came from art school, from a middle-class British background where music was a choice rather than a necessity. But Brown wasn't dismissing that difference. He was challenging Jagger to find what was necessary for him, what drove him beyond mere ambition or desire for fame, what made performance essential rather than optional? What turned technique into art and skill into expression? The answer Jagger found was distinctly his own. His performance style drew from multiple sources, but was filtered through his particular combination of intelligence, sensuality, androgyny, and raw charisma. He never became James Brown, never tried to replicate that particular genius. Instead, he became Mick Jagger, and that identity was strong enough to sustain a 60-year career at the highest levels of popular music. When James Brown died on Christmas Day 2006, tributes poured in from across the music world. Mick Jagger's statement was brief but deeply felt, acknowledging Brown's pioneering contributions to music and his influence on countless performers. He didn't mention the Apollo encounter, didn't claim any special connection or insight. But those who knew the story understood what was left unsaid. The debt that Jagger owed to that moment of honest confrontation, the gift of a challenge that pushed him beyond competence into greatness. The dressing room where that conversation took place is long gone. Renovated multiple times as the Apollo adapted to changing circumstances. But the lesson remains, passed down through generations of musicians who understand that authenticity isn't about perfecting imitation, but about finding your own truth. James Brown showed Mick Jagger that night that the greatest performances come from a place beyond technique, from a willingness to be genuinely yourself, even when that self is still being discovered. It's a lesson that transcends music, that applies to any creative endeavor where the goal is not just competence, but genuine expression. That's what happened backstage at the Apollo Theater on April 28, 1964. Two worlds collided. Two artists from vastly different backgrounds found common ground in their shared commitment to pushing performance beyond safe boundaries. What emerged from that collision was a deeper understanding of what it means to be authentic, to honor your influences while finding your own voice, to respect tradition while creating something new. The encounter lasted less than an hour, but its reverberations continue to shape how we think about performance, influence, and the complex negotiations of cultural exchange in popular music.